And here we are in the West, going about our daily, regular lives. It's such a strange reality in modern times. Is there a religious thread or a sub-thread of this present war that began when Putin's forces launched an invasion into Ukraine on February 24th of last year, nearly 9 months ago today? That's what our two speakers are here to talk about. With us, one, a Ukrainian Orthodox monk, as he puts it, who now teaches theology in Sweden, but for many years taught in Kyiv, in Moscow, and in Minsk, as well as California. And another voice, a Croat who grew up in then Yugoslavia and has taught theology and ethics in Croatia and in California, and now for more than 2 decades at Yale Divinity School. Our goal this morning is for our speakers to kind of give us a window into their own stories, which inform this horrible war, and then some of the broader publicly minded frameworks that come from wrestling theologically, as well as just wrestling personally with the reality of war. And as Miroslav asks in this wonderful book, which is called Exclusion and Embrace, had a reprint in 2019. It won the Grawemeyer Award. It was named by Christianity Today as being one of the best books of the 20th century. As Miroslav asks, best religious books. Is there any other kind for Christianity Today? But how does one remain loyal to the demands of justice for the oppressed, and yet also to the gift of forgiveness that the crucified offered to the perpetrators? Or for him, as his teacher asked in 1993, can I embrace a cynic? So I hope both of our speakers will shine light into some of the religious dynamics in play today in Ukraine and the tensions between Russia and the West, and also offer some of these larger norms, perspectives, frameworks, theological sort of reflections that have emerged out of their own wrestling with these issues, ethnic cleansing, divine, even reconciliation. Our plan is to hear first from Cyril for about 25 minutes with a particular lens on Ukraine, and then from Miroslav for 25 to 30 minutes with a window into his own story and some of these larger frameworks at the intersection of theology, ethics, and society, frameworks that may help us for covering some of these topics. You have their bios in your program, but just to supplement them a little bit, Arkham Hydrate, Cyril Overon is professor of ecclesiology and international relations and ecumenism at the Stockholm School of Theology in University College of Stockholm. In Ukraine, he began his studies in theoretical physics, and then continued wrestling with these larger questions and pivoted to theology, taking his study at the Orthodox Seminary and Academy in Kyiv. He then continued to study in Athens, Durham, in the UK, where he earned a PhD in post-Chalcedonian theology. He's since taught in the places mentioned, but Kyiv and Moscow in particular, and he's held fellowships at Yale, Columbia, Canada. Since 2019, he served as president of the Ukrainian Patristic Society. Especially commend to you his short book of political orthodoxies, the unorthodoxies of the church creed. Can today's Orthodox churches, he asks, turn away from political orthodoxy and embrace of power, and their embrace of power to a renewed apostolic patristic track? And Miroslav Volf is a Protestant theologian, and public intellectual, and Henry Wright Professor of Theology at Yale's Center for Faith and Culture. He taught Evangelical Theological Seminary in his native Osijek, Croatia, for 8 years, taught at Fuller, and received 2 advanced degrees under the venerable German theologian Jürgen Moltmann. His focus, how does Christian theology come to bear on broader public life, the broader questions, our culture, politics, economics. He served as an advisor to Obama's faith-based office for several years, taught a course at Yale on globalization with former Prime Minister Tony Blair, and like some of you, he's a frequent commentator on CNN and NPR and Al Jazeera. He's published books on forgiveness, the Trinity, grace, reconciliation, and how Christians can and should respond to and interact with Muslim believers. So with that, we're going to start with Cyril. Thank you so much for coming. What's going on in Ukraine, and how can we better understand it?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me here with you in this beautiful place. And let me try to explain some things. Especially, I'd like to focus on explaining the rationale of this war, which seems to be the most difficult part of it, to make sense of it, if there is any sense in this war. And I think this difficulty exists on both sides of the war. In the West, people really struggle to understand what is the point of this war, why Putin started it in the beginning. Is there any sense? Because it goes against any kind of pragmatism, any kind of his own interests of his country. When when he will lose this war, Russia will be completely different and not something that Putin wanted it to be. So it's going to be really a disaster for his country. So why he started it in the first place? That's the question that people face in the West. I'm afraid that the same kind of questions Putin asks himself. Why did he start this war? Of course, there are no public deliberations on why he started this war. But what we can guess from his statements, from his explanation, his lectures actually, because he likes lecturing. Like he started lecturing just on the eve of the war and continues doing so in history and other matters. So in his lectures, in his public speeches, in his press conferences, he tries, we can see it, he tries to make sense of this war for himself. And he's not quite successful, it seems. This has resulted into an interesting phenomenon, which I could describe as a kind of political theology of Putinism. Out of these attempts, a sort of political theology emerged, which is really peculiar, and I'd like to address this kind of political theology. Well, I started explaining this theology before. We don't usually say it before the war started, because the war started in 2014, and this war just escalated in February 2022. So in this book, actually, I try to explain some reasons why this war that started in 2014 happened, and now with the escalation, there are more reasons that I see that the way how I would explain this escalation would not be very much different from my explanations in this book. So it's a sort of continuum in the political theology that became more elaborated upon after the war escalated in February 2022. Let me illustrate this political theology of Putinism by a recent post on the Russian social media, Telegram, which is a very popular social media in Russia nowadays, by the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev. He played a rather humiliating role of Putin's placeholder between 2008 and 2012, before the first two, after the first two terms of Putin as a president and before he resumed power in 2012. At that time, he was considered to be a liberal guy. He was a friend of Steve Jobs, and he went to Silicon Valley, had selfies with the guys there. He really enjoyed himself, being a geek, and unlike, for example, he's very similar to he looks like Winnie the Pooh. But unlike Xi Jinping, we just discussed it, Xi Jinping, he really enjoyed this, to be compared with Winnie the Pooh. He had fun, he was kind of a different kind of personality from Putin. He was really, hiding himself behind the walls. And then he became a completely different personality, so it seems. And he started publishing on the social media the posts which demonstrate a completely different standpoint somehow, and at the same time they look like crazy texts. At the same time, they're quite revealing in what is really going on behind the Kremlin walls. So I translated this post into English from Russian, and it's really important, I think, to understand the political theology of Putinism. So Medvedev started by asking himself a question: what are we fighting for? And his answer is: Russia is a huge and rich country. We do not need foreign territories. We have everything in abundance. But there is our land, which is sacred to us, on which our ancestors lived and on which our people live today, which we will not give to anyone. We protect our people. We are fighting for all our people, for our land, for our 1,000 years history. Essentially, he explains the rationale, the kind of official rationale of the Russian political establishment for this war, that it's not really an aggressive war, it's not really a war, it's just an attempt to retake what belonged to Russia historically and which has to belong to Russia. And it's essentially, it's their land, the Russian land, which is Ukraine, that is their people, which are Ukrainian, who are Ukrainians, and that's their kind of discourse. Also, he refers to history, which is important because Putin seems to be obsessed with history. His long lectures are mostly on history, and he's obsessed about history in a quite a neophytic way, I would say, as a novice kind of historian, not really a professional historian. And he seems to be really fascinated. He's deep into the history, but it's a kind of history which is not academic, which is more like creating a new founding myth for Russia. As you know, every country, every nation needs a founding myth for itself. Russia had its founding myths. They go back like to the early modernity, to the, for example, a monk named Philofey from Pskov who introduced this idea of Moscow as the third Rome, which was a sort of kind of early founding myth for Russia. Then it continued in the period of Enlightenment in the early 19th century when Karamzin produced his own history, like in many volumes. He was a professional historian, but also he created a founding myth for Russia. So what Putin tries to do is to create a new founding myth for Russia in the situation after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he tries to do it kind of by combining historical facts and some ideological games. Medvedev is not like that. He doesn't seem to be very much interested in history. He mentions it because it's important to make a reference to Putin, but he stays away from history. What he actually tries to emphasize, and this is his difference from Putin, is exactly the metaphysical side of this war. He seems to be more metaphysical than Putin is. And it becomes clear in how he continues his exposition of this rationale of the war. So he then asks his question, who is fighting against us? And his answer is, we are fighting against those who hate us, who ban our language, our values, and even our faith, who spread hatred towards the history of our fatherland. A part of the dying world is today against us. This is a bunch of crazy Nazi junkies, folks drugged and intimidated by them, meaning the Ukrainian people. And the crazy Nazi junkies are Zelensky and the company. And a large pack of barking dogs from the Western Kennel. With them, there is a motley herd of drunken guilds and narrow-minded Philistines from the collapsing Western Empire, with saliva flowing down their cheeks from degeneration. Imagine, is the guy who is like in charge of the Security Council in Russia and the former president of Russia, the friend of Steve Jobs. They have no faith and ideals except for obscene habits invented by them, as well as standards of doublethink. They deny the morality bestowed on normal people. Therefore, by having reason against them, we have acquired sacred power. There, the language of sacrality comes in. And it's important to stress sacred power. So they consider themselves as having a special mission from God, who has endowed them with the sacred power to fight, to save the world from itself, and to fight for very sacred, noble reasons. This is a sort of exceptionalism, and they perceive themselves like really a city on the hill, exempted from the rest of the world, which I believe explains also the unprecedented Russian brutality, because it's a very brutal war, very probably even the Germans, the Nazis, the Gestapo didn't do the things that the Russians do, and we see as we liberate the territories, we see the kind of the torture rooms and how they treated people, how they killed people was really in a very brutal way. And I tried to explain to myself why they are so brutal. My explanation is that when you have this feeling that you are special, you have a special mission from God, then you are not bound by normal moral norms. Then you are free to do whatever your mission requires you to do. So I think the brutality is connected with the idea of messianism, with the idea of exceptionalism. And that's one of the, well, at least it's my explanation of this brutality. And Medvedev mentions to this that we have sacred power, so in the name of this sacred power, we do all those atrocities. Then Medvedev poses the question, where are our old friends? And by old friends, he means the Western allies, the Western countries, and those Russians who became enriched and benefited from Putin's regime, and they decided to leave, including like Tunis. There is a bunch of those old friends living here in this place, actually, in the neighborhood. They really prefer Cap-Ferrat is their favorite place. I'm not joking, it's really so. And it's, if you go, I just flew to the Nice airport and I saw a bunch of Russians, flying from Dubai to Nice, obviously quite rich people. And there are many of them here. So, Medvedev speaks about also those people who live now in Cap-Ferrat. And he answers this question. We have been abandoned by some frightened partners, and we do not care about them. So, they were not our friends in the first place, but just random companions, sticky and hangers-on. The cowardly traitors and greedy defectors retreated to distant lands, let their bones rot in a foreign land, meaning here. They are not among us, but we have become stronger and cleaner. So that is another kind of reference to a religious category of cleanness, kind of spiritual cleanness. They believe that by getting rid of those companions from the past, they become really cleaner. Then Medvedev poses the following question. Why were we silent for a long time? And he answers, we were weak and devastated by the emptiness that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now we have shaken off the sticky dream and the dreary haze of the last decades, into which the death of the former fatherland plunged us. Other countries are awaiting our awakening. They have been raped by the masters of darkness, slave traders and oppressors who dream of their monstrous colonial past and yearn to maintain their power over the world. Many countries do not believe their nonsense anymore, and he means the global south and the allies of Russia who are still there. So they don't believe anymore in their nonsense anymore, but are still afraid of them. Soon they will wake up completely. Then, when the rotten world order collapses, it will bury all its arrogant priests, bloodthirsty adepts, mocking servants, and dumb traitors under a multi-ton pile of the debris. In this point, Medvedev's prose sounds almost like Tolkien's. Like Tolkien, Medvedev prefers naming the existential ego by exotic names, while answering the question, what is our weapon? And he answers, weapons are different. We have the opportunity to send all enemies to the fiery Gehenna. Well, and here he means apparently to the nuclear weapons. But this is not our task, he reassures. We listen to the words of the Creator in our hearts and obey them. These words give us a sacred purpose. Another important reference. The goal is to stop the supreme lord of hell, whatever name he uses, Satan, Lucifer, or Iblis. Well, here he apparently refers to the Muslim demonology, where Iblis is a kind of a chief of demons, like an alternative to Shaitan, and different from Shaitan, but he still he plays a special role, a central place has a central place in the Muslim demonology. And by this, Medvedev apparently wants to actually appeal to both Christian theology and Muslim theology. He tries actually to bridge them and to recruit them for his cause on the basis of theological concepts. In this point, Medvedev concurs with Putin's recent rhetorics of desatanization of Ukraine. This rhetoric has made a long journey from denazification to desatanization, so kind of an evolution of rhetoric. And it seems that Medvedev likes this idea of desatanization. He really dwells on it. So he dwells more on the theological concepts than on the historical concepts, in contrast to Putin, who prefers history. And he just bypassing mentions the desatanization. Some people believe Medvedev writes these posts when he gets drunk. I would not exclude such possibility, given that there is really a pandemic of the Russian disease in the Kremlin nowadays. They report that an increasing number of people in the Kremlin just really get drunk in the morning, as early as in the morning. Yes, there is it's a very interesting indication how they cope, with the stress of the war. They just get drunk, the usual Russian thing. Yet I believe it's more than just drunkenness of Medvedev. It's a sort of theology, political theology, which serves the purposes of populism. He appeals to the popular concepts, and he essentially develops a sort of what can be called a religious populism. Actually, I should say that I know a bit Medvedev's family, how it works. He has a nice wife, Svetlana Medvedeva, who seems to be quite a devoted Orthodox Christian, actually. She's a part of a group of ladies, very influential ladies in the Russian political lobby, who, for example, in 2009 helped Patriarch Kirill to be elected as the Patriarch. She was pretty much behind this. And it happened under Medvedev, and I would say that if there were Putin in that period of time, probably Kirill would not be elected. He was really promoted by Medvedev's wife and Medvedev himself. So she's quite a devoted Orthodox kind of Christian. Imagine those ladies; they are really rich, and they would go to New York to St. Vladimir's. To Jordanville Seminary, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russian Seminary in Jordanville, New York. They would fly to the exams on their private jets, to that seminary. So this kind of devotion, and Medvedev himself is not the same kind of devotion. He's a secular mind. He's not really very much into religion, but he is, as we call it, under the hood of his wife to a great extent. He's really his wife's man. Wow. She's really a powerful woman, and he is not that powerful as a personality. The same, by the way, they said about Lyudmila Putin and Vladimir Putin himself. So he used to be like under power to the extent that he could not tolerate anymore. That's one of the reasons they say why they eventually divorced.
That was rich wife, and Vladimir Putin is today considered to be
a single, right? He's a divorcee, even though they never married properly. Well, the greatest. Well, probably under the fake names, and he has daughters. So it's a tricky that you can date Vladimir Putin, but that could be a double.
Can you just say, you were saying that he was under the control of, Vladimir Putin was under the control of?
Both.
His third wife?
Both. Well, actually he had at least 3 wives, or 3 women who brought him children. We don't know how more wives he had, women, apparently. And of course, this is one of the main protectors of the traditional family values in the world, which is usually the kind of the rule. But Medvedev is quite devoted to his family, I believe, and Svetlana Medvedeva still exercises a good deal of influence upon him, and I think his sort of religiosity comes from her. That's my point. It was not his kind of religiosity, kind of natural religiosity. It comes from his wife. And Of course, this sort of religiosity is very distorted. It's a very eclectic, so he picks some ideas from here and there, including from his wife, and then he combines those ideas into these sort of messages that he then propels to the Russian public. His messages, his posts indicate that there is an increasingly more elaborated theological language employed by the Kremlin. I remember very well. I was still in Moscow. I worked with Moscow Patriarchate for a long time, and I remember very well when the Kremlin started using the language which had been produced by the church. It was like approximately 2009, 2010, when they started speaking officially. I mean, in the Putin speeches, in the statements from the Kremlin, they started using the phrases like the traditional values, that kind of language which had been offered by the church to the Kremlin. Nowadays, recently Putin signed a law which is called for the protection of the traditional values. It's not just a language anymore. It's really laws, it's a court of law that, they say protects those. It's supposed to protect those values. So it's more than just a language nowadays, and the language, the intensity of this theological language has increased in the recent time, and this is an indication for me that they're really struggling with justifying this war. And if you don't know what to do, how to explain something, just go to theology and ask theologians. That's what they do usually, and that's exactly the case with Putinism. Therefore, I would yes, and this language is an important point that I wanted to say. It's not just it's important not just to explain this war for themselves, but also it's explain this war to the Russian people. Theological motivation was used by the Kremlin's propaganda as early as 2014 to start this war. I said that it started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and with the proximity to Donbass. Then there were messages, there were signals from the Russian propaganda that this war was something special. It was a holy war, against the evil West for the protection of Holy Rus. But at that time, this kind of rhetoric motivated the soldiers on the ground. So people came to Ukraine to fight in the name of those ideas, many of them. There was even a battalion, a special battalion called the Russian Orthodox Army. So they were clearly motivated, by religious ideas. But the things have changed since then. Nowadays, most soldiers are motivated to fight economically because they have mortgages, they have debts, they have credits in the banks, and essentially to repay those credits, they come to fight. That is the commonest motivation for the majority of the soldiers. But it's not. This motivation cannot work for the people behind them in the Russian mainland and heartland. So people in the heartland, because they face economic difficulties increasingly, they really get encouraged, and they need different sorts of motives, different sorts of explanations why they need to suffer. They don't gain money. They gain money only if their relatives are killed in Ukraine, and they receive like this old Russian Lada car. That's usually the equivalent of compensation for the killed members of the family. So they get from the state a car produced in Tariaki called Lada, and actually they had plans for this year, this factory, to produce 300,000 cars. And it was a joke that probably that was the estimation of the losses, of the Russian losses in the war. So people really face economical difficulties in mainland, in heartland Russia, and they need an explanation. And that is a sort of explanation, the theological explanation, which is propelled to them in order to convince them to continue supporting this war. So in 2014, the theological motivation worked mostly for the soldiers on the field, in the fields in Ukraine. Nowadays, this motivation doesn't work for them. They are not very much interested. But it works very well for their families back in Russia. That's why it's a sort of, what Medvedev says, it's a sort of religious populism exactly to address, to convince people to continue supporting this war. And that is also a very important point, because even after Putin is gone, and I wish he's gone as soon as possible, Putinism will stay with the people in Russia. So this is really a major problem. If we want to achieve a sustainable peace in Ukraine, so that the Russian people would not elect after Putin another Putin, and then another Putin, if they will want, in order to avoid them supporting another escalation of war after Putin, we need to address this kind of Putinism, populism, which is popular among them. It has infected really their souls. It has corrupted their souls, I would say. And it needs to be dealt with, this Putinism of the Russian psyche, this mysterious Russian psyche, famous Russian soul, which is now really a Putinist soul. And it needs, I believe, it needs to be dealt with theologically. Let me conclude with this. There are many similarities, I believe, between Putinism and the ideologies that clashed in the interwar period, and which the French philosopher Raymond Aron called religion séculière. In his article, L'avenir de religion séculière, The Future of Secular Religions, published in 1944, he argued that both communism and Nazism, and I quote him, reproduce certain distinctive characteristics of ancient dogmas. They too offer a global interpretation of the world, end quote. Yet there is also a difference between communism and Nazism on the one hand, and the religion séculière of Putinism. Putinism is a sort of religion séculière. The former, I mean, communism and Nazism, were deconstructed on the basis of secular ideas. By the way, this deconstruction work after World War II, I think, contributed somehow, it was the by-side effect of this deconstruction work, it contributed to the rise of secularism in Europe. Well, because Nazism and communism were deconstructed kind of on secular premises. And Putinism, in contrast to them, can be hardly reconstructed on the basis of secular ideas. It can and should be tackled theologically on the basis of the same traditions that it distorts, and I mean, in this case, the Orthodox Christianity. In this point, I would both agree and disagree with Hannah Arendt. She criticized Aron for applying to the anti-human ideologies the term religion, even if this religion is secular. She argued that the very nature of Christianity is to be apolitical, and I quote Hannah Arendt. The freedom which Christianity brought into the world was a freedom from politics. Probably you would also disagree that Christianity, and indeed any religion, could be apolitical in the real world. I would agree, however, that in the case of Stalinism, Hitlerism, and Putinism, we are facing a distorted version of religion. I believe we need to concentrate on correcting that. If we paraphrase Isaiah Berlin, who spoke, his famous book is the Crooked Timber of Humanity, we should deal with the crooked timber of politicized religion. And that's something that we need to do together. Thank you.
That's great, and let's turn to Miroslav Volf, who has wrestled with a lot of these very same themes.
Thank you, Cyril, for the insight into kind of bastardized theology of, what do we call it? Call it theology? I don't know. But it is, unfortunately, and some of the points that I want to make is a kind of a twisting of religious landscape that is used to motivate wars. So first, let me just give you a sense of how I'm approaching this, my topic. I'm kind of religious thinker interested in the role of religion in public life. That interest was generated when I was growing up in former Yugoslavia. As a religious person, I was the only openly professing Christian kid in my entire high school, which was kind of I was a phenomenon. They didn't quite know what to do with me, but obviously religion was suppressed, and suppressed by a kind of bastardized version of Marxism, Marxist Enlightenment critique. There are kind of sophisticated versions of Marxist critique, so don't take me to mean that all Marxist critiques of religions are problematic. They're problematic, but they're not bastardized, and we experienced this kind of critique, which amounted when I was growing up. So Christians believe that God is the Holy Trinity. 1 plus 1 plus 1 cannot be 1. That was the level of the critique, right? Which, okay, for those who know anything about tradition, obviously see that it's rather unpersuasive. So I'm interested in kind of how the religion functions in contemporary societies, but also I am interested in the kind of constructive, normative side of religion. I'm a theologian. I'm not just a person who does religious studies. So that's as a background. Now, in the wake of the breakup of Yugoslavia, what we experienced was kind of religiously motivated reassertions of ethnic identities. And at that time, that was late 80s, beginning of 90s, globalization processes were in full swing, as you would recall, and were highly celebrated. The world was uniting, but Yugoslavia was falling apart. And often the sense was, what are these barbarians in Balkans doing when the whole world, Europe included, is uniting, kind of in the sign of unenlightened barbarity. Alan Finkelkraut, I'm not sure whether I'm pronouncing that name rightly, how can one be a Croatian? Tries to pick up this idea. Why would anybody want to be a Croatian? You name any other ethnic group in that context. Now, certainly, identity, I would say, is not barbarity, but can lead to it. And we have seen that in many domains, including former Yugoslavia. Joss has mentioned my book, Exclusion and Embrace, and the book arose out of deep tension that I felt during the war between my own commitment to non-violence. I take seriously the commandment of Jesus that one should love one's enemy. Indeed, I think that if one were to erase the notion of the love of enemy, one would unchristian Christianity. That's a pretty strong statement. But how does one fit that commitment to the commitment to justice at the same time that when 1/3 of your country has been occupied and you are trying somehow to survive this, not just with you trying to struggle for the good of the people who have suffered. How does one, which was also my question, how does one and what does one do to prevent the enemy from occupying one's own soul after occupying the territory? How does one prevent being made into the image of the very violence that's perpetrated against one? That was for me existentially one of the most fundamental questions, but that existential question has very important intellectual challenges. How does one think relationship between religion and contemporary world? How do I live as a religious person in that world, and how do I contribute as a religious person to a vision of the world that is hospitable to all people? Now, like in former Yugoslavia, in today's identitarian movements, religion is playing a very significant role. It's not certainly sole role, maybe not a dominant role. When I was teaching this class on religion and globalization, I had a mantra for my students. The mantra was, all monocausal explanations are suspect. I kept repeating that over and over so that after the class finished, after the semester finished, students created a T-shirt which we all wear. All monocausal relations are suspect, but nonetheless, religion played a significant role, and I think Cyril has described also partly the way in which it played. To me, it was interesting because religion became reduced to the marker of identity. And probably the most famous case is this sign, right? You will recognize that. This is not a botched peace sign, as you well know, right? So the thumb sticking out, but rather it represents a certain form of Christianity, a certain form of Christianity that crosses, that suggested crossing oneself with three fingers put together and two fingers pointing down, which are three persons of the Holy Trinity and two natures of Christ. And now you are in the thick of theology, right? Those are the most sacred theological doctrines of the Christianity. But if you see a fighter riding on a tank flashing this sign, none of that theological content obviously is on their minds. That is a religion that has been completely hollowed out of its internal content and functioning simply as a marker of identity. This is us over against whoever is them. You know, in the other way in which religion has functioned is a kind of, and you can see that in the presentation, Medvedev's post is kind of sacralizing political power, and in that sense kind of legitimizing it in two ways, functions in this way. And it's interesting what happens to religious traditions, and Buddhism might be a very interesting case. The way, excuse me, the way Buddhism functions in Sri Lanka, for instance, or Sri Lanka, or the way in which Buddhism functions in today's Myanmar. You have also this kind of inner hollowing of Buddhist teaching, so as for it to become a simple marker of identity and differentiation and justification of political power. Now today's, I think, identitarian movements, just like in former, just like in the struggles in former Yugoslavia, share, I think, three important features. And that is primacy of ethnocultural identity over shared humanity. The stress on hard and pure, and in certain regard at least, pure identities, the kind of logic of purity has been mentioned already, has functioned that way in former Yugoslavia. Ethnic cleansing is nothing but enactment of the logic of certain kind of purity. So first, primacy of ethnocultural identity over shared humanity. Two, a stress on these pure identities. And third, legitimacy of violence for protection of group identities. Now, when one takes kind of a normative accounts of Christianity, you might very clearly, easily see that they're on all three of these points, they kind of cross the major convictions of those faiths, of Christian faith. And maybe, to me, a very good example of how contrary identitarian philosophies are to the classical Christian tradition is work of Alain de Benoit. Again, I'm butchering probably the name, but if you read his book Paganism and the Critique of Monotheist Religions, particularly Christianity, then you'll see that it revolves around the question of kind of limited ethnic identity, that it revolves around the question of violence and builds on this kind of ancient pagan and formulating a neo-pagan alternative to the Christian tradition, Jewish and Christian tradition. Affirms the primacy, Christian tradition affirms the primacy of shared humanity over ethnocultural identities, requires construction of complex, dynamic identities, and certainly rejects deployment of violence in defense of group identities. And it's very interesting, there's a long Christian tradition of thinking about just war. But just war was never construed and cannot be construed as a defense of group identity. If it's constructed, it must be constructed as defense of lives of people and not of identity. And that's a very different, I think, proposition. Let me shift now in my presentation a bit from a kind of description and maybe a critique of deployment of religion in ethno-cultural struggles to what I feel that lies often behind those, as I see it lurking behind the identitarian struggles of today, is a deep and sometimes unacknowledged disquietude of living in times that are out of joint. I think that our world, our current age, seems to be dying, but another one hasn't been sufficiently formed to be born. We are in a rupture. I mean, we as humanity today. Rupture is in us, and in some ways, rupture is us. And the great challenge of our times, which is both deeply existential, personal, and also global, is what do we do while living in this gap? What do we do while living in this rupture? And I want to kind of encourage you to think in those terms by taking up a notion of a metaphor of the world. What kind of metaphor of the world do we need for the new world to be born? The idea comes from a poem by American poet Archibald MacLeish. And portion of that poem goes like this. A world ends when its metaphor has died. An age becomes an age, and all besides, when sensuous poets, in their pride, invent emblems for the soul's consent that speak the meanings men will never know, but man-imagined images can show. It perishes when those images, though seen, no longer mean. The world perishes when some such images, though seen, no longer mean. Now, I didn't plan this, but I want you to stop at this moment and think maybe for a minute or two of the metaphor for the world. For you, what would be a metaphor for the world to be born? And just imagine, remember, this is a poetic work. Or you can put it this way, this is a normative work. You're imagining, dreaming up a world. But of course, dream, even very small dream, is not just an isolated thing. There is no such a thing as an isolated dream. If you dream of working a particular job, as an engineer, a baker, a lawyer, a teacher, journalist, you are also dreaming of clients, of ingredients, a whole legal system, of students in the school, of institutions, of modes of communication, of audiences. Hope for joy, very, very personal. And you will find that joy too is woven into the tapestry of the world over which it is right and good to rejoice. Dream of a home, and you will find yourself inevitably dreaming of some combination of neighborhood, geography, physical structure, things both comforting and useful, and crucially of other people inside and outside the home that makes it what it is. When you dream a life, you dream a world. Take a minute and come up with a metaphor for yourself of a world, and I'll return to the last part of my comments. Am I making it uncomfortable?
Can you give us an example of what you mean by making a metaphor? Give us an example of what we might come up with.
Or like if you taught at Yale, like what's the right answer? What's the right answer?
No, there's not. So, proletarians unite.
That's not a metaphor. That's
Well, it's a slogan.
Image.
It's a slogan, but it's an image of something, right? Or you can. So I will try to explicate the metaphor of home as a metaphor of a world
That you want to see.
that I want to see.
Foundational.
Foundational, yes. That is to say, I mean, I can, yeah. Or to give me
The beloved community.
the beloved. There we go. The beloved community, or.
A community of shared prosperity for mankind. Who's saying that? China.
So,
That's their metaphor.
and there we go. So let's step back and this is an excellent exercise. What do you imagine? On what grounds might you imagine? What does it express about your life in relation to the life of the whole? I suppose my intuition is that without us having such a thing, we cannot have a world together. And one of the great problems of our times is precisely that our dreams have been so incredibly fragmented. Time of petty dreams that we live in. Even some of those great dreams seem to me quite petty in terms of where they might take us and what they might entail. Do you think about it? It's advertising. Advertising. Life Worth Living is the title of the book. That these are advanced, uncorrected proofs, and are not for sale yet. But it's a course that I've been teaching for about 9 years at Yale to undergrads, primarily. Quite a few students take it. One of the most popular humanities course at Yale. And the fundamental question that we are asking in that course is, what is worth wanting? Not what do you want, and how do you achieve that what you want. Not even what do you really want, because sometimes we want things and we realize in the process of wanting them that this is not what we really want, and so we adjust those expectations. But a normative question, what is worth wanting? And I think that idea of what is worth wanting, especially if you think of it that individual things that you might want are tied to a vision of the world, that I think is a question that we need to pursue, that we need to have clarity. And obviously many of us will have very different answers to this question. We live in a pluralistic world, and the course that we teach is also a pluralistic course in that sense, that there are multiple ways in which traditions answer that question. But the problem that we find ourselves in my judgment, estimation, is that we have unlearned to ask that very question. That is to say, the university education, as I experience it, is about how do you get from point A to point B. That point A can be whatever it is, and that point B can be also whatever it is. And this is absolutely extraordinary and stunning accomplishments at the level educational and other levels. There are kind of techniques that we have mastered and mastered really well, impressively and deeply, and fantastically. But at the same time, what we don't know exactly is what that point B should be. Compared to the course, I don't talk about any of this, but since you asked that question, triggered all this stuff. So compared to, for instance, at Stanford, a very famous course that you probably know is Design Your Life. And it's a kind of masterfully designed course itself. But if you read the book, your bestseller, if you read the book, then you'll see that about 3.5 pages are devoted to what I've described here as B. That is to say, the end goal toward which one you're designing anything. How do you discern that? The entirety of the book is from how do you get from A to point B. my fundamental question, and I think our humanity's fundamental question is, what kind of being is worth achieving? Because right now we are capable of achieving a great deal of things, but we are not reflecting on actually what's worth achieving and why. And that's a normative question. And that question is the one on which the future of the world begins. That question is the one which is expressed in a dream, which is expressed in a metaphor that somehow also has to be motivated. Now, I've taken your time away from dreaming that for coming up with a metaphor, relieved you of that task. But nonetheless, I want to invite you to think, and maybe I should say a few words about home, and then I'll go from there. I think one of the metaphors that I found extremely useful for myself over the past 5 years or so is a home metaphor of home, the world as a home, both as a material and social and very personal space. That's what actually, in some ways, home is. Now, some of you will know that especially the identitarian movements today rest on a critique of modernity, and that critique of modernity partly is tied to, Roger Scruton expressed it, that modernity is oikophobic. That is to say, it fears home, and it fears home because homes have boundaries. Homes have certain kind of internal coherence, and modernity is predicated on the idea of crossing those kinds of boundaries. Modernity is individualistic. Homes cannot be understood as individualistic, and so home ends up being a very uncomfortable metaphor, and home ends up being the metaphor that always is in opposition to other homes. I have a home in opposition to other, not just in distinction, but also in opposition to other homes. And home, metaphor of home, as was in the case of the World War II with Nazism, as it was the case in the identitarian movements, is then used more as a fortress to push us against the others. Now, what if you imagine the whole world, the planet, as a home? And imagine planet as a home of homes. And then try to integrate the personal, social, and the material dimensions, which I think are essential for the home of being home. And I think I draw that metaphor from the long tradition of biblical, arc of biblical story, which is construed around home. Exodus, the book of Exodus, some of you will know, is one of the most fundamental political documents of Western tradition. But Exodus, liberation of children of Israel from slavery in Egypt, is the telos, is a certain kind of home. And the biblical traditions also end in the book of Revelation with a vision of the New Jerusalem, which is a home of God coming to be among mortals and inhabited by peoples, which is to say a pluralistic kind of vision of a home. And from there I draw the notion of world as a home of homes. I think we can integrate into that image ecological concerns for the health of the entirety of the planet, political concerns for the managing of the roots of that planet, and very personal concern. Final comment, one of the issues with modernity, one of the issues of our time is what sociologist Hartmut Rosa has addressed in his book Resonance. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. Rosa is fairly familiar in German sociological circles. The book is called Resonance, and the basic argument of this 900-page book is that we need to find that modernity is characterized by the fact that the world has become stumm. World does not speak to us anymore. It has become the world of things, in a sense, that are not, with which we do not resonate. How does one return the resonance to resonant relationship with the world, which alone can motivate deeper engagement with things and respect for things qua things, rather than simply objects of utility, which is what you have in a home, right? A good home, you come and everything speaks to it in that home. A smell whiffs from the kitchen, that's being cooked right there, and the whole history is in that really whiff of from the kitchen. You come in, and maybe there's a chair in which you've been sitting for a while, and this is your chair. And when you put your hands on the arms of that chair, you kind of recognize you are at home. Modernity has robbed us of this, and we need return to resonance with the world. We need return to seeing the world as a space which is ours, for which we care, and to which we belong together, distinct and different that we are. My metaphor for a world, some kind of a home. What's your metaphor?
Thank you, Miroslav. All right, I neglected to mention that restrooms are just down this hallway and to the right, so it's adult learning, come and go as you see. And we're gonna go about 25 minutes with questions now, and then take a break for coffee and then come back. And the plan basically is to go to about 11:50, 11:55, and then we'll walk across the hall for lunch. And the first question on the gate is from Marianne Kahn at the Times. You're on.
Can you hear me? A question for Cyril. I wanted to ask you about the figure of Alexander Dugin and how he fits into the political theology of Putinism. So he's held up, maybe erroneously, by in the Western media as the intellectual forefather of what you describe as the political theology of Putinism. And how does his critique of modernity fit into what you've described? And also, I mean, maybe that I spend too much time in the dark parts of the internet, but I've noticed that Dugin's philosophy is also being taken up as theology for some Christians, for some Muslims, as a very coherent and intellectual way of thinking about the world. And it seems to be difficult to divorce him from Putin, but can you do that and then look at Dugin on his own terms without everything that's going on right now?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. This is quite often a common question that people ask about his role in forming Putinism. Well, I think Dugin is more serious about theology than Putin or Medvedev or anyone else in the Kremlin, because his background is really religious. He comes from the Old Believers family, which was actually, interestingly, well, non-believers are non-conformists in Russia. They were never like with the state. They were oppressed by the state, and Dugin demonstrates this mentality of being like, of preferring to be on the margins. Even now, when he has become so much popular, he stays somehow from the center, from the mainstream Putinism. And there are also other reasons for that. First of all, Dugin is really an elitist thinker. He is not a thinker for the masses. That's why I think his role is overestimated in the West. He doesn't appeal to the Russian people, to the masses. His ideas are too complicated even for himself, I would say. Well, sometimes, well, he's just like Medvedev. He gets intoxicated, and writes things which don't make sense. That's why his role is really marginal in today's Russia, but after the murder of his daughter, he was propelled as a new hero, in the pantheon of Putin's kind of heroes. He was awarded some kind of award, and Putin personally addressed this murder. And Dugin became promoted not as a philosopher so much, but as a father of a daughter who was also herself a philosopher who suffered, because of this killing. Even the Pope Francis, mentioned this. He said that, well, look, an innocent child was killed, in Russia, and how we can tolerate it, even though that she was not a child, she was a very convinced Putinist. She was really an ideologist. She really wanted this war to happen. She endorsed this war. But in the perception, the public image, the popular image that the Russian propaganda now projects is there is an innocent child, and this kind of father who suffers the loss of his child, and look, admire them. That is his role nowadays, not as a thinker, but as a father who actually tries to capitalize quite obviously on the death of his daughter. In the speech that he gave during the funeral, it was like a speech of a propagandist, not a mourning father, but a person who really, look, we will know revenge, we will do it. It's an opportunity, he said, it's an opportunity for us to promote our ideas, what we believe, what we stand for. That will be his role nowadays, not so much as a thinker. So he is a thinker more in the West, but not in Russia.
And I neglected to mention, sorry, that if you want to pop your table card up, if you've got a question, that'll help the cause. Tunku Raj is up with the Wall Street Journal editorial board.
Hi, thank you. This is a question from both of you, but it plays off a phrase that Miroslav used. You said that identity is not barbarity, but it can lead to it, or words, kindred words. What is the antidote? Although you ask us to be suspicious of monocausal explanations, but you also suggested this happens, identity becomes barbarity when religion is merged with identity. Is there an antidote? If so, how do we stop identity bleeding into barbarity, becoming barbarity? And I'd love to hear from both of you.
Some of I think antidote against bad religion, you can think of it two ways: no religion at all, or better religion. I think prospects of no religion are relatively low, because there's some kind of form of normative vision is going to be deployed, which will have either be a religion or function as a religion. And my sense has always been that if we attended more to the great religious traditions, in my case it is Christian faith, but I can imagine other religious traditions as well, as an extended forms of debate over centuries, that in them we do find a kind of visions that can push against this kind of barbaric forms of identity struggles in which we're often involved. That would require dynamic conceptions of identity. That would require a certain relationship to violence and the deployment of violence. My sense is again that we've got to renew the kind of the search for what truly matters the most, because these heavy investments in identity of this sort and of religion as guardian of those identities seem to me always to kind of emerge at the expense of the kind of the profound sense of what life is truly, what kind of life is truly worth living. Now, this is obviously answer given by a philosopher, theologian. There are political forms of answer to it. There are economic kinds of dimensions of this answer, and I'd like to invite folks to contribute to those. I think identitarian struggle are in part because, to continue with my image of home, if you imagine the world as a home, and if at one end you have a person who has $2 million a day, and another end you've got a person who has maybe $1.50 a day and a pitcher of muddied water to drink and barely any food to eat, you can very easily see why a certain forms of identity would form in struggle against the kind of incredible oppressive character of the situation in which we find ourselves, and so forth.
Briefly, how to deal with the religion that turns into identity, I think, is to make identity devoted back to religion somehow, to the tradition that had produced this identity. That's actually one of the main points that I wanted to make in my presentation. In order to deal, for example, with Putinism, which is a sort of identity, because Putin essentially harvests on this identity thing, and we saw it in various posts. There are also two ways to eliminate this tradition altogether, the tradition that had propelled this distortion of tradition, or to go back to the tradition. Go back to the tradition that had been distorted. So my point is that it would be probably a wrong way to apply the secularistic kind of criteria to deconstruct Putinism. It should be deconstructed only on the basis of religion by harvesting from the religious tradition and by deconstructing the religious tradition itself. I mean, in my case, the Orthodox Christianity can help us, I believe, to deconstruct Putinism that has distorted this tradition. So that would be my answer.
Why don't we jump next to Maragay from the New York Times editorial board.
Thanks, Josh. Miroslav, you talk, I think, quite convincingly about us living this time of this gap in between worlds, but I feel like we're all sitting here kind of in the shadow of, we're talking about Nazism, Stalinism, now Putinism, Trumpism. So maybe this is certainly not a question just for our time, but I do wonder, I mean, it feels to me that some people are committed, as I believe you are, just listening to you and meeting you yesterday, some people are committed to the human experience, but others are committed only to themselves and their own human experience throughout time. So I wonder what your perspective is on how to grapple with that. Do you engage those people? Do you carry on with the work that you're talking about in spite of them? What are your thoughts on this?
I find that it's very tough to engage today across the hardened line of difference. People have called me a theologian of the bridge, and the book Služba and Embrace was an attempt to create a bridge, to think of the faith, Christian faith, as a kind of reconciling faith, bridge building. I've done that in relationship to Islam and Christianity, and my experience in the present moment is just as it was with sometimes some really fundamentalistic forms of Islam. When I have engaged in Muslim-Christian relation, and I had some of the very fundamentalistic, either Muslims or fundamentalistic Christians in the audience, it was very clear that any attempt at reconciliation would be understood always already as a weakening of the position, and therefore is directed against one or the other, or is perceived as directed against the other side. As many know, in the war situation, that's exactly it. If you try to defect a bit and see things from the perspective of the other, you already are involved in the act of betrayal. So I find that in many situations we are like that in the United States, where people simply do not have sufficient freedom to step out. I take it that requires of us, one, to continue being committed to the reconciling process, notwithstanding. And I think it requires a community of those committed to that to be engaged. I think in very real terms, the future of our world depends on our ability, notwithstanding the lines of difference, to live together in some sort of peace, maybe too strong, but at least in ways in which wouldn't deepen those lines and destroy our lives. That's partly what motivates this work on life worth living, because it is a pluralistic conversation, and we need to learn how to do this conversation across the lines of difference. That's very hard these days, and it's an important task, yours and mine.
Let's see if we can maybe get one or two more questions, and then we'll break. Katrin Van Holt, New York Times, Berlin Desk.
Hi, thank you both for your presentations. I cover populism, and I've been dealing a lot with poverty extremism across Europe, but particularly in Germany. And what struck me over the last few years is how Putin has become a figure that people admire. He turns up in chats and, is kind of revered. What's interesting here, and I'm just sort of playing devil's advocate, I don't have the answer, is the sort of focus on religion that particularly you, Cyril, focused on. The people I talk to speak about ethnicity. They talk about Putin as a protector of white Europeans and of sort of European nations. There is an element of we don't like Muslims, and religion in that sense creeps in, but it's a very superficial level. So I wonder to what extent you believe that the kind of Medvedev type argument and rant is actually efficient. My sense from the kind of radicalized Putin admirers in the West certainly is that it isn't, that actually it's the secular, it's in some ways the Nazism variety of secular ideology that is powerful. And so I wonder to what extent this fad at the moment of focusing on Dugin and of actually looking a lot at the religious aspect of this is a distraction from something that's much more, good old familiar racism, anti-Semitism, conspiracy theory.
Yeah, an excellent question, difficult to answer really. I believe Putin managed to convince people from the unbridgeable communities, like alt-right, alt-left communities to believe it. So it's a paradox that he is revered not just among the conservatives like in Europe and Germany, he's also revered in Latin America or Africa, among the anti-colonial folks. That hence is the reference of Medvedev to those, against oppression, against the powers and so forth. Essentially, Putin acts as a postmodernist in a sense. He plays with ideas. He sells those ideas to different groups of people. Those ideas are irreconcilable. They don't kind of match each other. But he's successful in selling them separately to different groups. That's why he's admired by the nationalists in Europe or by the anti-imperialist globalists, in the global South. The thing is that he doesn't believe in those ideas. He plays them. And essentially what he really wants, he wants to destroy all those, folks in Germany, nationalists and so forth. For him, they are the rotten West, still, all of them. Not just, the liberals, all the kind of groups of, including Alternative for Germany, for example. For him, they are not worthy to be, to deal with. But they believe that he is for them, he stands for their values, which is wrong, which is really exactly a misconception of what Putin tries to achieve. He wants to destroy the West, all West.
Just on that point, the first international leader to visit Putin after, the day of the invasion was Imran Khan, who went to Kremlin and sort of bestowed Putin as the great defender of Europe's Muslims. Sorry, Imran Khan, who was then still Prime Minister of Pakistan, was the first international leader to visit Putin the day after the invasion and held up Putin as the great defender of Europe's Muslims and the only defender of Islam in a continent which is rife with Islamophobia.
Yeah.
So he played that card.
He plays all the cards, including the Islamic, and that's hence other reference to Iblis, for example, in the videos. Was Putin really tries to project his messages in a way so that the Muslim communities would subscribe to them, even though what he does essentially he's destroyed, like what he does in Syria, he destroys Muslims, well, Christians as well. Those counter bombardments of Aleppo, for example, killed mostly Muslims. In Chechnya, for example, he destroyed Chechnya. Well, we say that the Chechens are now benefited, by Putin's regime. No, it's just one tape, one clan in Chechnya, Kadyrov's clan, which is benefited. The rest are oppressed. People disappear. People get killed, and they are Muslims. So what he did in Crimea to the Tatars, he eliminated every Muslim group in Crimea that disagreed with him. So it's exactly like that. He pretends to be protecting the Muslims, essentially kills Muslims in bunches.
And remind us just of the demography real fast. That 146 million people in Russia, 3 million people in Ukraine.
Yeah.
How many people are Orthodox Christian, the Orthodox Church members in those two places?
Yeah, well, in Russia it's mostly the identity thing, like Miroslav has indicated. Imagine that maybe 3, maximum 5% of the Russian population would be churchgoers, would go to the church like for the major feasts. Otherwise, like over 80% would identify themselves as Orthodox, but it's just an identity thing. And that's why Putin essentially employs this identity theology much more than he employs theology per se. In Ukraine, it's a bit different in the sense that yes, there are more churchgoers in Ukraine, and the majority of them are Orthodox Christians, but there are many identity Christians, like what we call cultural Christianity as well. Not in the same proportions in Russia. In Russia, it's really it's a huge difference, like 3% of really Christians, and the rest are cultural Christians.
Mattia, I see from Ildemani.
Thank you. 2 questions for Cyril. One is about, is it more historical? You said that the Kremlin around 2009, 2010 started to sort of like incorporate a religious vocabulary and religious categories to justify. So I wonder what happened then, because if, and please if you can fill in, I don't remember, but I'd like to have your take on this. I don't remember justifying the war in Georgia in 2008 or in Chechen war with that kind of language. But my sense from my limited knowledge is that in that period of time, 2009 to 10, something changed.
Exactly.
And that, I wonder what is that? What is that change? The second thing is that if you can tell us something more about the role of Pater Kirill in all this, because it seems to me from, again, my very limited knowledge, that Medvedev's rants are sort of the Telegram-friendly translation of sermons of Kirill in a different register and a different type of thing, but it seems like that is drawing, that's the source to me, the way I understand it.
Thank you for an excellent question indeed. Well, indeed, you notice it well. In Georgia, and before that, during the 2 Chechen wars, there were no religious justifications for the war, even in Georgia. They started coming up after the war in Georgia in 2008. What changed that? Well, I believe Putin really is a very small, mediocre person without big ideas. He started like that. You know, in KGB he had a nickname, a cigarette butt.
Cigarette butt.
Yeah. Well, because he is short, literally, and his kind of intellectual capacities are quite limited. He's smart. I mean, he's weak, but he's not wise, and he could not develop big ideas. I believe that big ideas to him came from the church, from Pater Kirill. I knew Pater Kirill very well, and I know that he is capable of thinking big. He really thinks in the civilizational terms, in the cosmic terms. Now, Putin, we can read him as thinking in cosmic terms, but those ideas are not his. He borrowed those ideas, and he borrowed them from some kind of intellectuals like Ivan Ilyin, for example, the Russian philosopher, well, actually endorsed Nazism, by the way, and recently from the church, from Kirill. So that's why it's my kind of very, kind of hypothesis, which is difficult to prove. But my hypothesis is that this war would have been impossible without the input from the church, because it was inspired by big ideas that the Kremlin was unable to produce in the first place. Only when those ideas just crossed the walls of the Kremlin and became appropriated within the Kremlin, they produced the new policies for the Kremlin, including the war. That would be kind of my concern.
And is it right that Kirill has a $30,000 watch and that he's stealing $4 billion from the Kremlin, and that his endorsement in 2012 of Putin was over the top, and Putin is the great preacher. It's a unique relationship.
Well, look, it's a system. I would say we had this conversation about how Kirill treated some businessmen in Russia. He treated them just as any other Russian person from the Russian establishment would treat the foreigners to to cheat them, to steal from them, and so forth. The church is a part of the Russian political establishment, has become a part of the Russian establishment. Actually, it should be said that Kirill's purpose was not to become, rich and those watches. I know it embarrasses people in the West. It doesn't embarrass people in Russia. Because this is a part of their corporate culture in Russia, for example. You know why they have expensive watches? Because when they sit in front of you like this with the watches, they indicate how much my time costs to you. That's very simple. That's a message. And it's practical. It's nothing. It's not about having funny things. It's a message, right? So it's not important. What is important, I think, for Kirill was he wanted to put the Russian church back to the center of the public square in Russia after it had been eliminated from the square under the communists. That was his main struggle. His theology is a public square-based theology, essentially. He wanted the church to bring from the ghetto, and remember him talking very often about ghetto, and to bring it back to the public square. He managed it. He has achieved it. The church is back to the public square. The question is, at what cost? The cost is really is huge for the church in terms of reputation. Well, some people believe it has lost, this church identity to an extent. It has ceased to be a church, actually. But it is in the center, and Kirill is just a part of this establishment. He's in the center of this public center.
All right, well, if we can resume, feel free to make this second portion, especially because we just got caffeine, a little bit more interactive. We'll try to keep the basic structure, but if it's something that's burning and urgent, feel free to get in. We've got Rim Sarah, Tim Alberta, Rachel Donadio, and Shadi to start off. Rim Sarah, you are up first if you're ready.
I was born ready.
Of course you can.
Hi. Thank you for your brilliant, insightful presentations. I will be the boring academic, so if you excuse me. So I'm going to focus some remarks and question about the elements of language, which I find fascinating. Of course, I'm not going to compare my country, France, with other countries. It's not the point, but I think there is a common ground with the element of language that I notice in Russia when they talk about traditional values, right? In France, especially with the rise of certain identitarian movement, whether it's Christian nationalist or what I call hardliner secularist, we talk about Judeo-Christian values against usually the Muslim population, but forgetting, by the way, what we did to the Jews for quite some time and keep doing. Or the Republican values, but against those who are perceived as a threat to whatever Republican values we're talking about. Impossible to define, but they're here. And I was wondering, that's what I believe, but I want to insight on it, about a sort of transnational movement of a form of radicalized secularism. In France, I talk about the weaponization of laicity, which used to be just a liberal concept aimed at organizing the relation of state and religion. We have a history with religion, that's not the point, but we have been weaponized it for identitarian reasons. And as well, the right wing, which, and a certain part of the left as well, which use laicity but against others. And it's not anymore a tool to separate church and state, but really a tool to target the visibility of religion, and even for some fringe to impose it as some sort of civil religion. So I was wondering, what do you make of it? What are the common grounds? And we all know, especially in the influence of Russia on the far right in Western Europe, it's the case in France, the influence, the reference as well, whether the element of language, the techniques, the maneuvers. So what are your insights about it? Thank you so much.
I could start answering this question. Well, indeed, secularism has become a sort of important ideology as a part of the Russian discourses, modern Russian discourses. So I mentioned Medvedev's in the Medvedev's posts. He refers to it indirectly when he says that the West threatens our own faith, which is exactly to say this secularism, which comes from the West, is a threat to us, and they exploit apparently this idea, and they say, look, we are withstanding. Yes, we are not just protecting, our traditional values against the LGBTQ and all those kind of Western propaganda. As they say, no, we protect ourselves from the Western secularism as well, which had become weaponized, as you rightly said. Even though in the Soviet period, that was the ultimate degree of weaponization of secularism, because the Soviet atheism, which was the only established religion in the Soviet Union, right? It was the ultimate form of secularism. Now and it's kind of a paradox of this thinking, of their thinking, because they want to integrate the Soviet past with a new post-Soviet situation, and they've integrated to this kind of the idea of the Great Patriotic War, World War II, and all those things from the Stalin's period, but they actually ignore the secularism, the anti-religious propaganda that happened in the Soviet Union. Instead, they accuse the West of this sort of propaganda without acknowledging their own anti-religious propaganda in the past. Hence is my point, again, which I want to stress. It will be impossible to tackle Putinism on the secular premises, because they will say, look, they use the enemy, our enemy, secularism, to attack us. That's why the only way for us to survive as an ideologist and as an ideology would be to fight this secularism. If we address Putinism on the secular premises, it will help them to defend themselves. That's why it is important, I believe, to tackle Putinism on the theological premises.
Mm-hmm. You want to weigh in on that one, or?
Just a quick comment. It would seem to me that one of the central issues is how do we keep pluralism alive? And often rhetoric of secularism seems and is experienced as anti-pluralist. And so both secularists, in my experience, and also religious folks, neither of them has so much problem with democracy as with pluralistic democracy. And so I think we need accounts of democracy that would be sensitive to kind of pluralism of actual deep convictions, some kind of a consocial view of political theology, political philosophy, I'm sorry.
Let's jump, if we can, to Tom Nuttall, senior editor at The Economist.
Sure, thank you. I had a couple of questions that was sort of partly following on from someone's earlier. You said, Cyril, before that the war couldn't have happened without the church, in the sense that the Orthodox Church provided Putin with some sort of intellectual framework that he himself was not capable of providing. And there's a couple of things that I wanted to ask about that. One is, you began your talk by saying that Putin seemed to have immersed himself in a very sort of eccentric form of history. Yeah. And something that I often hear from European officials is that they think that COVID, Putin's isolation during COVID, he sort of buried himself in these weird archives in the Kremlin and produced all sorts of eccentric theories. And I wondered, to what extent, I mean, if there's some truth to that, which it's probably quite difficult to ascertain, but if there is some truth to that, is there a religious element to that? Or is it something a little bit more sort of pagan, some sort of mystical idea of the Russian soul that the Ukrainians, corrupted by the West, need to be brought back into the fold? To what extent is there a formal religious element to that? And then looked at the other way around. What does the church in Russia itself have to say about the war? My impression, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea in particular, also what happened in the Donbass, that this was something that was presented very proudly to the Russian population as a righteous victory, a return of Crimea to the place that it should always have been. Now we have a Russian population that we're told is sort of indifferent and apathetic towards the war. It's not something that is at the heart of the regime's propaganda efforts towards its own people. But it's now coming closer to the people, particularly with this new partial mobilization, hundreds of thousands of people, reservists being drawn into it. Is there now going to have to be a fresh justification for why this is happening to people? And if so, might it be given some sort of religious shrouding?
Thank you for several questions. I'll try to briefly answer all of them. Look, well, those are alpha dogs. Imagine them sitting in the bunker for 2 years without being able to do anything. they've accumulated so much energy, which is now blasted in the war. So I think COVID has to do with this war, because they were tired of sitting, they wanted to stretch out, and they went to stretch out. Another thing that while sitting in the bunker for 2 years, Putin what else did he do? He read, apparently. He read historical books, and hence are his ideas, about history. So that's also related. Speaking about his religiosity, paganism, and so forth. Look, I think, many perceive Putin as a kind of, especially in Russia, that as an Orthodox Christian, like a traditional Orthodox Christian. Essentially, what he represents is a very shallow version of late Soviet religiosity, which was a combination of very basic ideas that re-emerged on the surface after the period of militant atheism. That they include magical thinking. They include superstitions, numerology. Well, Putin started his war. Essentially, he was supposed to start this war on the 22nd of the 2nd of 22. He started his war in Germany on the 8th of the 8th of 2008. Yes, well, it's not. I mean, it's a part of this religious thinking, which is very magical, very superstitial. And again, I believe Putin is profoundly, religiously a dualist. A dualistic worldview sees the world in black and white, with parts of the world being ontologically good and other parts of the world being ontologically bad. For them, the West is the ontologically bad, Manichaean, in the Manichaean sense, part of the world. And Russia is a holy land. Is the example. It's like, there were Montanists in the kind of early centuries. They perceived a plot of land in what is modern Turkey as the holy piece, which is surrounded by the evil ocean, of evilness. And Putin perceives Russia in the same terms, in dualistic terms. For him, the West is really rotten, but it's rotten not because of the choice of the people, but because it is so from by its nature. And Russia is good by its nature. Hence and that's why I would say that his threat of the nuclear war is really dangerous, because if you see the kind of the enemy as ontologically evil that cannot be changed, the only way to purge it, to change it, just to eliminate it. In his thinking, it would fit his thinking, his dualistic thinking. That's why it is dangerous, I believe. So his religiosity is really interesting to discuss. It's a result of these late Soviet developments. It's very dualistic. And speaking about the church corroborates this kind of thinking, unfortunately. Speaking about the church in the war, and I will be really brief, I would identify 4 parts within the Russian church. There is a tiny minority which is outspoken against the war within the Russian church. The size of this minority is like that. 300 priests approximately signed a letter in March after the war started. It's less than 1% from 40,000 priests in the Russian church. Less than 1% became outspoken against the war. There is a larger but still small minority who are outspoken for the war. They go, to the Russian channels, and they say why the war is important, why it should be supported, and so forth. Then there is a silent majority within the Russian church, which has 2 parts. There is a silent majority, a part, let me put it this way: the majority of the silent majority is passively for the war. The minority of the silent majority is passively against the war, but they don't speak up. That would be kind of the situation.
It's really helpful. Let's go next to Rachel Donadio, Paris-based writer for The Atlantic.
Hi, thank you so much, both of you. I'm following up on Tom's questions. I wonder if you, Cyril in particular, could talk a little bit more to help us kind of get into the line between Putin and Putinism. And you've talked about the role of the church in Putinism as a kind of secular religion. What could potentially dismantle that? If Putinism exists after Putin, how do we understand that better? And I also just wondered, just out of curiosity, if there are other writers, thinkers, books, people we should be aware of. For me, at least 2 of the books that have helped me understand this best are Svetlana Alexievich's Secondhand Time, The Oral History of Post-Soviet Russia, which kind of gets at this spiritual hunger that seems to have said it. We believed in the Soviet Union. Of course, we didn't believe in it. It was this ridiculous utopia, but when it ended, well, what are we supposed to believe in? And the other is a book that you and I spoke about last night, which
Sorokin,
is
yeah.
Vladimir Sorokin's
Sorokin,
Day of
yeah.
the Approachnik, which I recommend to everyone. It's
Yeah.
extremely funny, and it also involves metaphysics, day drinking, nihilistic violence, and you know, Kremlin.
Yeah.
And I feel like those books have kind of helped me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm just
Yeah.
you know, always
Well,
looking for recommendations. Thank you.
well, I start with the end. I really would endorse your reading list. Indeed, Sorokin is really prophetic as a fiction writer, and even though he wrote about the situation of Putinism like 10 years ago, it's like like a prophecy being fulfilled. Alexievich she's also very good in providing some insights into this phenomenon, even though she wrote her books before Putinism emerged, right? I would also recommend maybe Pelevin, who is kind of another fiction writer, who anatomizes somehow the ideas behind Putinism. From the academic side, I would recommend Sergei Plokhy, who's at Harvard, the head of the Ukrainian Institute in Harvard. He's very he publishes a lot, and he's been translated to many languages, so that with him. And Tim Snyder, of course, from Yale, he is a great resource for understanding this war, incredibly helpful. Speaking about Putin and Putinism, that's exactly the point. Putin is not the main problem in this situation. It is Putinism which is the main problem, because this problem will persist, will survive Putin. That is the very unfortunate thing. That's why, yes, we need to focus on removing Putin, because that will end the war. But also we need to think of dealing with Putinism, because dealing with Putinism will make the peace sustainable. Otherwise, the war will come back again and again. That's our fear in Ukraine, and that's why I believe it is important to understand what is Putinism. And unfortunately, Putinism is a combination of the ideas of the secular ideas and religious ideas. And again, I want to repeat it. It needs to be dealt theologically, not just Yes, how. I just want to recall the example and the experience of Miroslav's teacher, Jürgen Moltmann, who contributed to the theology after Auschwitz, after the World War II, the theology that actually helped to deconstruct the totalitarian theologies that existed in the interwar period, and they were really interconfessional. The tendencies of justifying fascism existed, like, for example, in the Catholic Church. It was even called Christofascism. It was a theological trend, popular in Italy, among the Deutsche Christen in Germany. So there were totalitarian theologies. The same totalitarian theologies existed in the Orthodox milieu. Like we had theologians, especially in Romania, which were anti-Semitic, very anti-democratic and so forth, like Nikifor Krajnik, for example. Then this kind of theology, which was a mainstream theology, was deconstructed after World War II by the intellectual effort of theologians like Jürgen Moltmann and others. And that's how a new theology, which Miroslav represents so well, actually helps us to stay away from that bad theology that existed in the interwar period. But we, the Orthodox, were only lightly affected by the new theology. That's why the old interwar theology reemerges in our milieux, like Nikifor Krajnik is again popular in Romania, or theologians that were ultimately anti-Semitic in the kind of, even before the Bolshevik Revolution, are again popular in Russia. It's a major problem. So Putinism is a mosaic consisting of all those pieces, and they need to be kind of deconstructed theologically by saying that it should be an intellectual kind of effort, ecumenical effort, people from different traditions representing with the experience of overcoming the bad theologies in Europe of the interwar period need to come together and to figure out how to deal with this new monster, which is so similar to the totalitarian theologies of the 30s.
Let's turn next, if we can, to Christine O'Krent, who hosts a weekly radio program on French culture, and which many of you will know from your watching her on television when you're a kid.
That was last century. Thank you very much to both of you for taking us to other horizons. My question would be primarily to Cyril. First question about your way of dating Putin's revisionist form of rewriting history. It seems to me, for those of us who are interested in more mundane geopolitical issues, that Putin, as far back as 2007 in Munich,
that was the
defense,
landmark
conference,
Yeah.
did say that after all, the great history of Russia was to reconquer its empire, and so this sort of neo-colonial approach, it seems to me, has been there for a very long time. And it was only the parenthesis of end of Gorbachev and Yeltsin, which made us believe that somehow that Russian dream had vanished, which was, of course, very foolish on our part. The same way you talk about the brutality, it seems to me that the Stalin brutality, when it comes to warfare, wasn't really a joke either. And so, unfortunately, the way that today the Russian army shows that extraordinary discrepancy between the horrors of exposing its own soldiers to the front line without any way to fight properly, I mean, from their point of view, is an amazing approach to that same brutality towards the same people who are now Russians and no longer ethnic minorities coming from the Far East. But I have a specific question about the Orthodox churches in Ukraine, because your world of Orthodoxy is intensely political and fascinating. As I recall, there was that split within the Ukrainian churches between those faithful to Kirill, that great guy, who started, I think, trafficking cigarettes when he was a young pope.
The rumors say.
And so Kirill and Bartholomew in Constantinople. So to what extent has the split of those Ukrainian Orthodox churches played their part in the extraordinary revival or birth, to some extent, of Ukrainian nationalism?
Thank you for many questions. I'll try to address them briefly. Speaking about revisionism, and I agree with you, it started all in Munich in the Security Forum in 2007. Then no one believed, no one paid enough attention to what Putin said, and he meant it. He was sincere at that time. That was his program, and that was the program of revisionist. I call it the Putin's program is make Russia great again, essentially. That is his kind of the bottom line of what he tries to achieve. I would also call that in a more sophisticated Dugin-like style. It's like make Byzantium great again, because they believe it's about the revival of the Byzantine old empire. It's very similar to Mussolini's project of make Roman Empire great again. That was essentially the essence of Mussolini's project, right? So it's all about the revival of the old empire, the phantoms of the old empires. All of them failed, but they keep trying. And it's, of course, this war is not a new thing for Ukraine. We lived through this for decades and centuries. Remember Holodomor, the famine under Stalin, when, the different estimations, around 5 million people died out of starvation, artificial starvation. That's what Putin tries to do again with the blockade of the ports in Odessa. He tries to impose the same kind of starvation, not just on Ukraine now, but on Africa and other parts of the world. That is Stalin's policies. There's nothing new about that. And now about the Orthodox churches in Ukraine. The Orthodox churches in Ukraine is a small part of a larger picture. It mirrors what is happening in the global Orthodoxy. The global Orthodoxy is divided, even polarized. Fortunately, we don't have papacy, like we don't have the one person in charge of everything, a pope. That's why it helps us to preserve our diversity. Speaking about diversity, I think it's something that we really value. And we have a spectrum of ideas. Like on the one hand, on the one side of the spectrum is Bartholomew, the ecumenical patriarch, who is outspoken against the war. He's very supportive to Ukraine. He's probably the most really clear religious leader globally, who speaks out and who condemns the war. Then we have Patriarch Kirill, who speaks exactly the opposite in supporting the war. And in between, we have an array of religious leaders, the primates, the patriarchs, and others, who either kind of they half speak about the war or just pretend to, well, try to keep silent without saying what they mean. So we have a variety of opinions. I don't like this variety in the sense that I want them all to speak against the war, but still we have a reality of diversity of opinions. And I think it's also not bad per se, because it means that at least we can have healthy voices within our community. And the same is in the Ukrainian churches. The Ukrainian churches were polarized even more before the war. I mean, before the escalation of the war in February, when on the one hand there was this Moscow Patriarchate that just ignored the war that started in 2014, and then there was a new church established with the assistance of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Autocephalous Church, established in 2018, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which became very outspoken against the war and became really a leading force in this resistance against the Russian aggression. So now they get closer because of the war, because they have the same enemy, but still they fight each other, which is kind of not good. And the last thing that I wanted to say is about the nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism. I believe there is Ukrainian nationalism, and it's but despite the war, it's really small. Not a single nationalistic party managed to get to the parliament. Not a single one. Then I would say the majority of the Ukrainians who resist Russia, they are much more in favor of the idea of civil society than of nationhood. For them, it's the war for freedom. It's not the war for their identity. Well, they use identity in order to fight for freedom, but the identity is not the end goal, so to say. That's why, and it goes back to the Orange Revolution and the Maidan, the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, which was mostly the revolution for the values of civil society, not for the nationhood. There were nationalists in the Maidan as well, but they were really a tiny minority, and they continue to be a tiny minority. Well, unfortunately, the churches play into this nationalism. Yes, that's true. That especially the Autocephalous Church, I mean the new church, somehow uses the rhetoric of nationalism, with nationalism being the end goal of it. But still, it's not a mainstream, I would say. The majority of the Ukrainian civil society stand for the civil values rather than national identities.
Thank you. Let's turn next to Tim Alberta with The Atlantic, who, by the way, wrote a book called American Carnage, all about Trump, if you haven't read that one. Just give you a sense of where he's coming from. Tim Alberta.
Thank you for the plug, Josh. Thank you both for all of your insights and your eloquence. This has been a real treat for me. I have a lot that I'm going to try to unpack here, and forgive me if it's a bit scrambled. Bear with me. And forgive me also for processing so much of what you said through a Western lens, and more specifically through an American lens, as I think about some of the lessons we're to take from all this. It strikes me that 10 or 15 years ago, as Islamists were weaponizing the faith traditions of Islam to wreak havoc on parts of the world, that there was so much time spent and ink spilled in the West on this idea of recruiting and elevating the voices of moderate Muslims to push back and to try to reclaim the mantle of Islam and to sort of take back its identity. And of course, again, I ask you to forgive me for processing it through an American lens. We do not have a land war happening in America that is inspired by any sort of theological authoritarianism. But we do have, I think, very much a war for the identity of American Christianity, and specifically in a conservative evangelical context. We have a very real struggle happening right now that is sort of, I think, reaching a fever pitch. And so what I'm wondering as I listen to you both is, I would not dare to call them, how do the moderate Christians take back Christianity? Because in the evangelical world, if you are a moderate, you are a liberal. And if you are a liberal, you're a Marxist. And if you're a Marxist, you hate America and don't care about our freedoms. And that just becomes an untenable conversation to have. but perhaps the reasonable Christians or the serious Christians, the coherent Christians. How do we, very concretely speaking, how do we hope to have them retake the mantle of Christianity when fundamentally and inherently so many of those serious Christians do not believe that it is their role to engage culturally, socially, politically in the way that many of these other do? I mean, it seems to me that there's a bit of a paradox here, because if you sincerely and deeply believe that your kingdom is not of this world and that your struggle is not against flesh and blood and that you are to fix your eyes on what you cannot see, then, those folks are not only the least inclined to engage politically in these struggles, but they are the most observant of the moral boundaries of these struggles that would prevent them from perhaps justifying their ends with theological means. So I'm wondering, you spoke about the sort of effort post-World War II to deconstruct some of this. I'm wondering very practically, very concretely, how you view that effort now.
I wonder if we might actually start with Miroslav on this one.
I'm wondering how many actually of American Christians, even conservative evangelicals, think that in kind of purely spiritual terms, if I understood you correctly, as you've described, so kind of detached from the realities of lived lives. In my travels, I encountered very few of those. Very conservative, they would be interested in kind of this worldly realities. But I find very difficult in evangelical circles, or what was now evangelicalism that has now become, is it has been captured by nationalist idea. White nationalism, Christian nationalism seems to me a predominant form of evangelical Christianity. Even 20 years ago, if it was there, it was under the surface. But the answer to how do you capture, I have actually, frankly, no idea. Because there's something really powerfully insular about this vision that it's almost like I have experienced it as impenetrable. And I've known many of these folks, known them quite a long time, and just as it's very difficult to talk to your ordinary neighbors who disagree on political grounds, so also it's difficult to have theological discussions at all. So, sorry, no deeper insight into what might be able to kind of destabilize.
Do you view that as an indictment of the American church itself? Is there a theological shallowness that you would attribute that to? In other words, if you're being discipled by Fox News more than you're being discipled by the gospel, then this could be a problem.
Yes, I think that's quite right, and I think there is a loss in particularly evangelical criticism. Phil Gorski, our colleague from Yale, is very good at that. A description of evangelicalism in that sense, that there is a kind of a loss of educated, thoughtful leadership. Leaders of evangelicals have become media personalities. Paula White is a very good example of somebody who is highly influential, but has the thinnest of all possible understandings of the complexities of faith and possibilities of making those bare. How does evangelicalism transform itself so that it returns back to its root of relatively educated, actually, clergy that will be able to, in a judicious way, make judicious judgments? I don't know.
Let's turn next to Emma Tucker. editor of the Sunday Times.
Actually, I think my observation stroke question follows on quite nicely from what Tim was saying. So Cyril, when you were describing Putinism as a secular religion, the one thing that kept springing into my mind was Trumpism, which shows all the sort of elements of a secular religion. In other words, unshakable faith, a total refusal to grapple with facts, and a possibility that once Trump is gone, Trumpism could continue, just as you were saying, Putinism could. So I don't know whether you think, are there sort of broader forces at work here, beyond religion that are driving, or whether you agree that Trumpism amounts to a similar sort of secular faith?
Well, I would personally completely agree with this assessment, and certainly we're dealing with a similar sort of secular religion. Well, just one clarification. There is a civil religion and there is a political religion. Those are two things. And Phil Gorski exactly was very good in describing the civil religion in the United States, which is the kind of the backbone of the American political culture. In Russia, it started as a civil religion, but it evolved into something different, into in the 30s in Europe they called political religion. People like Vogel, for example, politische Religionen. Essentially, it was a form of the totalitarian ideology, dressed in the religious forms. The difference between them, in my judgment, is like the difference between the commercials on TV, when the civil religion actually advertises itself, and then you choose whether to subscribe to it, to accept it or not to accept it, to buy into it or not to buy into it. Political religion is less optional. It's imposed by the state. So if you disagree, you may end up in Dachau or in exile or wherever. That was exactly Hitlerism, Nazism, and communism. They were political religions. They were much more violent. And that is exactly the transformation that happened to Putinism. It started as a civil religion with a set of rituals, quasi-religious rituals, ideas that were optional for the Russian people. Now it's not optional anymore. It's a political religion with all strength of power, of imposition upon the Russians. So that I think that would be an important clarification in order for us to understand how to deal with this. In Trumpism, we are still dealing with civil religion, a form of civil religion. It's not yet political. It's not yet there. It's interesting, the first things, this magazine. I once, I think it was 2016 or 17, I submitted my piece to the First Things magazine in the US, where I argued that political religion is possible in the United States in the form of Trumpism. That article was rejected by the editors. But I still believe it is possible, unfortunately.
Maybe let's go next to Shadi Hamid, a scholar at Brookings, contributing writer at The Atlantic.
Yeah, so I've been hearing a lot about the Russian Orthodox Church, and I guess I'm struggling with a couple things. In all of our description of the church and its role, I've heard very little theology, but more specifically, I've heard very little about Christ.
Yep.
So I'm less familiar with the Orthodox forms of Christianity, and I'm more influenced, like others here, by evangelicals and Catholics in the U.S. context, where, even with Trump supporting evangelicals, Christ, as far as I can tell, is still very central in their imagination. And I'm somewhat reticent to say that they're somehow less reasonably Christian if they support Trump, but that's a different topic. But so, it just might be that in the Orthodox Church, the personal relationship with Christ is just simply less predominant, and that's less of an organizing principle. But if that's so, what exactly are the relevant aspects of the Russian Orthodox theology? What makes it recognizably Christian?
Yeah.
I mean, presumably there is Christian ethics in the Russian Orthodox Church, but I never get a sense of the Christian ethical frame.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of a mystery to me. And just the other thing I wanted, and Miroslav, I'd be interested if you have thoughts on this as well. But the other thing, just in hearing both of your presentations that stood out to me, is this idea that I've been thinking about more, that we're seeing political conversions more and more. And by that I mean people who convert to Catholicism to reflect their political identity. And I wouldn't want to, you might have, I don't want to besmirch people's commitment to Catholicism. This isn't really my view, but I have heard the argument made that certain recent Catholic converts they're not real Catholics, they're political Catholics. So take that, that's a bigger debate on its own. But we also had another political conversion recently, one of the most important perhaps in the last decade, if not longer. I don't want to overstate this, but it could be a seismic shift, which is the conversion of Andrew Tate to Islam. Mm-hmm. And we have one of it's kind of funny, but we do actually have one of the world's leading experts on Andrew Tate in this room. So Mehreen actually is like a scholar of Andrew Tate. Tateism, yeah. But if you listen to Andrew Tate's conversion videos, they're fascinating to me because he doesn't talk about Islamic theology. There's nothing actually about Islamic content. It's about how Islam speaks to his politics. So he basically is a misogynist who thinks that women should be obedient, and that that's like one of his major themes. And he believes Islam is the best way to get to the obedient Islamic woman who serves her husband. And he also likes the idea of Islam being strong in comparison to Christianity, which is weak. So he wants us. So anyway, it's just interesting that when you look at some of these examples, you start to see, it's confusing because how do you disentangle the politics from the religion? Religion and politics do go hand in hand in complex ways. But anyway, those are just some impressions. I would just be curious if you have any reactions to those points.
Yeah, maybe just briefly. I think you're quite right, and it seems to me that religion is. I've tried to differentiate. I don't know whether it's entirely plausible between thick religiosity and thin religiosity. Partly building on Geertz and then later Michael Walzer, and this seems to me, Tate, for instance, as well as others, seems to be a particularly clear case of what I might describe a thin religiosity. Right? It was completely hollowed from within, and certain kind of sacred aura remains that is being deployed for particular political purposes. You ask about Christ in various conversions, recent conversions, and you might ask as well about the role of Christ in larger American evangelical Christianity. I've come to believe, and I've said that also publicly, that Christ, I mean Christ of the Gospels, not necessarily historical, just Christ of the Gospel as one reason, has become moral stranger to us, meaning to us as Christians. And by that I mean the things, if you read the Gospels, that profoundly mattered to Christ, marginally mattered to most evangelical Christians. And things that really profoundly mattered to them marginally mattered to Christ of the Gospels. And there is then in that sense, in a sense in which Christ is the really key to Christianity, in which you cannot have Christianity without Christ. We are, in certain sense, in the evangelical crisis of Christianity, precisely because of a certain alienation from Christ. Christ seems irrelevant in many ways. And that's partly then responds back to Tim's question. If the renewal of Christianity can happen through reference back to Christ, that door seems to be relatively closed. And that's one of the major problems as I perceive it. Renewal can come, I think, only going back to those sources, or it may simply dissipate in kind of motivation, religious motivation for political choices that are made outside of the sphere of that fundamentals of that tradition.
Could you elaborate on those examples? I'm curious to hear those values of Christ that we care marginally about, and the things
Christ cared deeply about the poor. Poor are hardly mentioned there. Christ cared very little about fame. In fact, if you read the beginnings of the Mark's Gospel, he kind of tries to avoid fame, right? Because he knows that fame is going to skew perception of who he is. We are drunk on fame. If there is no fame, we cannot function. Beatitudes take love of enemy, for instance, that for Christ was absolutely central, plays virtually no role, and not even lip service is being paid to this. Take the way we look, how much time we spend, most folks, to present ourselves, me included. If you read the Gospels, you have not a single description of how Jesus Christ looked. And I can go down the line of fundamental values of modernity, fundamental values of most of us, and contrast to what one finds in the Gospel, and you find incredible discrepancy. Now, I am pretty much committed follower of Christ, right? And I find it deeply disturbing. I'm thinking, what do we do about this? And especially since if we find ourselves, as I'm saying, in this rupture, we need new ways of thinking, radically new ways of thinking. And maybe Christ, among others, might contribute to that.
All right, so our wonderful problem is too much energy and not enough time. We've got 4 questions, and we've got Rob Gifford, Thomas Chatterton-Williams, Katrin Benhold, the Tate Scholar, Marian Kahn, and Mattia Farista. And so, yes, Ed, real quick, and then let's just take a question from Thomas and Rob together, and we'll wrap with that this time, okay?
Well, I just want to add to this that the political evangelism, at least rhetorically, is Christocentric. It's very, very clear. Political orthodoxy is not. It avoids speaking about Christ. If you take Medvedev or Putin or others, they don't speak about Christ. They speak about other things pertinent to the faith. That is an important thing. And to come back, to avoid, to overcome this crisis, I think it's going back to Christ. It should be really Christocentric, for me at least, as a Christian.
Is Christ central to Russian Orthodoxy?
Well, that's the thing. To our tradition, Eastern Christian tradition, Christ is absolutely the center. That's absolutely the center. But in political orthodoxy, as a politicized form of my tradition, he is on the periphery.
And you can't put numbers to this, but if you were to try, Ukrainian Orthodox churches, Ukrainian Orthodox Christians, is the
people who
balance percentage-wise?
Say those who identify themselves as Orthodox would be 70% of the Ukrainians. Up to 10% are Greek Catholics, meaning Eastern Christians under Rome, and the rest are evangelicals, mostly evangelicals. That would be the numbers of believers.
Great. Thank you. All right, so if Thomas and Rob can each give us a good hanging question, and we'll let one final comment from our speakers.
This might be somewhat of a tangent, but to stay with Miroslav on the American situation, it got me thinking the lack of Christ in Christian evangelical politics, because my maternal family they're evangelical Christians, and my aunt is someone that I think of as keeping Christ very personally in her life, but she voted for Trump twice and said that he's a very flawed human being, but the only way she could get herself motivated to block a truly evil woman was to think that God works with flawed human beings all the time to do a greater good. And she just moved from California to Georgia, and we were talking, and she was saying that she would vote for Herschel Walker. And I was trying to square this. How can a Christianity accommodate itself to such appalling anti-Christian conduct? And once you get to a point where you can say anybody's conduct can be excused because God has a larger plan and uses flawed vessels, then what is left of an actual Christianity at that point?
So that's a Miroslav question. And let's do Miroslav, and then we'll go to Rob. Okay, that's probably better.
I think you identified the problem really well. I think part of the problem is also because very often evangelical Christians have been persuaded in a single issue that matters much more than the kind of host of other issues, so that you don't take the entirety of the package, but you take a kind of defining issue, which is a litmus kind of test. Supreme Court justice's abortion might be the issue on which one focuses, rather than in a broad spectrum of issues, and then it would look very differently if they were to think in those terms.
Is there a way to get people to stop thinking in those terms, or is once that has been crossed, is it lost? Is what I can say that there's a way to try, and in personal conversations, I persuade people, and then as soon as they become part of their own tribe, they immediately say the same the same things as before, because they're afraid that those walls are going to be eroded, and then everything's gonna fall away. But there is a relatively large silent middle, and I'm not sure what particularly their role is. I wish that would be more studied.
Wonderful. And last question goes to Rob Gifford.
I just wanted to throw in an answer to that. I think part of it is also just fear, isn't it? It's fear, and we sort of, we don't like to get into the weeds of the woke stuff, but I think, why would any Christian vote for Herschel Walker? Part of it, in fact, Bill Maher did a whole sequence on this the other day. Go and watch it. Where he got into this. It's like they're so worried about the woke stuff coming to the high school, their kids' high school, that anything is better than that. Even Herschel Walker is better than that. And I don't know if that's true, but
Actually, that's what my aunt was talking about.
Yep.
6-year-old comes home and talking about like a boy can be a girl. And
right.
All over.
So some of the stuff we were talking about last night, it's that I think there's no doubt that plays into it. I mean, not to say that that's an okay reason to vote for Herschel Walker, but there's no doubt that plays into it. That people are kind of petrified of that stuff coming in, and so they'll overlook anything. Which, of course, whether that's a good thing or not, I think is a big question. But I'm sure that's a part of it. Just to sort of come up to 30,000 feet, maybe to finish off, I had a question, because you used the word again, the word rupture. I just thought that was kind of interesting. I mean, and I guess we've been going through the rupture for a while, but you talked about the rupture. I presume you mean the rupture of Western, Western civilization. The rupture of the big. So and you were saying what is what to do, what we should do or think while we're going through the rupture. So I guess my question was, religion is a big part of that, and I think that's what you're saying. And religion is part of the problem because it gets weaponized, but then at the same time, it gave the sort of questions of meaning that we now don't have so much. Our meaning and purpose now comes from within us and not from outside us as it used to. So my question, I guess, was what comes, as well as thinking about going through the rupture, what comes after the rupture? And where does religion fit in? And what's the time frame? And when that word rupture seemed quite a big word, and I'd like you to enlarge on that a bit about what comes after the rupture and what role religion plays in that.
How long should this come and be? I mean, there is a sense, right, that the world cannot continue as it is going on a number of fronts. You will know that better than I. And the question is, one. Two, it would seem to me that fundamental values which are to orient our lives. Whether they come from us or whether they come from some transcendent source, will always be normative values. That is to say, that cannot be defended strictly on either scientific or rational grounds. We cannot, that is to say, the normative visions are by definition such that that cannot be derived simply from observation. Where do they come? That is a significant issue. And even as we inherit them, how do we negotiate those values? Under what auspices do we think, or with what metaphor do we think the world, so that we can proceed in negotiating and thinking through the values, or letting the values that will guide us emerge? That is a fundamental question, as I see it, before which the humanity stands. And sooner we start attending to it, the better will be.
Wonderful.
What does it look like after this rupture has happened? What's the time frame of rupture?
I have no idea. It depends partly what we do. That is to say, I can sketch to you what happens as the one world is ending and the new world is being born.
Those seem quite apocalyptic phrases, like the old world is ending and the new world is being born. Are you talking in specifically religious terms, in terms of religion in society, or are you talking about the path of liberalism and how it deals with these great conflicts?
I'm talking about we cannot continue the course of modernity and accelerations of modernity, of which are part of us indefinitely. Our environment cannot sustain that course. I think we cannot continue relating to the world basically in the way in which we do, as a thing to be used for resources. A number of other ways in which the course is not sustainable. I'm really not thinking about in apocalyptic terms. I mean, I invoke them just to invoke the seriousness of the situation. But I don't see us, educational institution, I'm at Yale, I don't see us thinking in terms of what might be the possibilities, what we might imagine the world like. That seems pretty far from most of my students. They're asking, here's a point A, here's point A, here's point B, I need to find a way how to get there, and tend not to think much further than that. And that may be a very worthy point B, but the larger normative questions are pushed aside, and we're not educated to take them up seriously.
Well, that was a lovely open answer, and I would only add, Rob, you got to follow the basic rules. Like, don't do what the Kremlin does and get drunk before you're writing. That's a good start. And, no monocausal solutions. The right metaphor. All right, so we have a lot to work with. We're basically right across the way for lunch. There are no place settings for lunch, so sit with a new friend. And the only sort of hard rule is that we'll be back in this room at 1:30 sharp. To start off with a sort of next steps conversation about democracy, pluralism, identity, open thinking with Aline and Shadi. Okay, so 1:30 back in this room. Enjoy lunch just across the way. Yeah, thank you.